So these different systems of tenure raise a myriad of questions, and having answers to these questions will help you to improve your programming and your project outcomes. Here are some questions you might want to be thinking about if you're designing or implementing a project that has a land component. Be sure you understand who it is in the system or within your project and program who's defining, assigning, and enforcing land rights. Sometimes that may be the government, sometimes it may be a provincial government, sometimes it may be the national government, but in other cases it may well be a customary authority or a traditional leader or a religious leader. It's important to understand who can have rights and conversely, who cannot have rights in this system. Are there outsiders, for example, who cannot have rights and because of that will be disadvantaged unless that issue is addressed through some sort of policy change? What are the kinds of rights that people can hold? Can they transfer land? Can they mortgage land? In many countries in the developing world, mortgaging is not permissible, in rural areas especially. Understanding what happens if a right is violated can be extremely important if you're engaged in an access to justice program. Rights, when they're violated, the violation may be addressed by an informal dispute resolver. It may, on the other hand, be addressed by a formal dispute resolver. If that formal system is so backlogged with court cases that you're not likely to get a resolution to your dispute in the next 5, 10, in some cases even 20 years, what you'll oftentimes see people doing is working around the formal justice system. And you could create programming that would help them in an important way work around that problem by creating effective mediation systems. Final definition for this section. You'll hear people increasingly in the land sector talk about good land governance as opposed to just land tenure and property rights. Now we have a focus on a more holistic approach, which is improving land governance in the countries where we work. So land governance refers to the mechanisms through which decisions about land tenure and land use are made, how they're implemented, and how they're enforced. So kind of looking at the whole system taken together. And that means looking at what are the policies, formal and informal, related to land, what are the institutions, and how capable are those institutions that engage with and allocate rights and use, allocate access to and use rights over land, and what are the processes to allow those transfers, allocations to happen. Remember again that when we talk about land governance, it can be happening in an informal setting and it can be happening in a formal setting. So why should you care about this issue? Why does land tenure and property rights matter? Well, it matters because it's intimately connected to so many of the development objectives that you are likely to be working with. That means that if we don't effectively address land tenure and property rights issues, we may fail to meet our development objectives. So a couple of points on this. Land tenure matters because land is a critical asset for the people with whom you're probably working. Land has the most foundational linkage to multiple dimensions of poverty. It is critically important to creating inclusive prosperity, combating extreme poverty, and building resilience. But around the world, poor land governance prevails. Land governance matters because when rights and access to land and resources are ineffective, women and vulnerable people are placed at risk, producers are less likely to make important improvements to their land, housing and reliable municipal services face constraints, the investment climate and the finance climate suffers. Land tenure and property rights are part of the broad enabling environment. Land tenure and resource rights matter because resource degradation and environmental tensions increase when people don't have secure rights over land and resources. And perhaps most importantly, certainly most visibly, when land tenure and property rights are insecure, it tends to generate conflict within families, between neighbors, across societies. Land tenure and property rights also matter because when rights and access to land and resources are effectively implemented, women and vulnerable groups are empowered. Producers are more likely to invest, and that can enhance productivity. It can move people to produce and grow higher value crops That can help incomes, but it can also help address food insecurity concerns. When these rights are effective and people feel secure in them, housing and reliable municipal service provision is more likely to work effectively. The climate for investment and finance is strengthened. People do a better job of being stewards of the land, the soil, the forests, and the other resources they live with because they have incentives to protect those things. And finally, in situations where people understand what their rights are enforced effectively and impartially, there tends to be much less conflict over land. Again, whether that's within a family, among neighbors, or more broadly across a society. So what's the evidence for these claims? Those are some pretty lofty claims we've just been making. You can see from this infographic produced by Landesa. Landesa is a leading land-oriented NGO in the United States, that when people have more secure rights over their land, annual family incomes can increase by as much as 150%. Interestingly, when people have more, and women especially have more secure rights over land and other resources, teenage pregnancies can be cut in half. Okay, so if land tenure and property rights are such an important piece of helping us to address development objectives, what are some of the challenges around including land tenure and property rights components in programming? Let me first talk about and provide you with a high-level summary of some important land tenure and property rights problems. We were talking a moment ago about what happens when those systems are ineffective and then what can happen on the positive side when they're effective. So when property rights systems are ineffective, this means that the rights themselves may not be clearly identified either in law or in practice. Or it may be the case that an informal system and a formal system are overlapping. It could also be the case that rights are not efficiently transferable, and it is really important for people to be able to transfer use rights over land and resources from someone who can't use them so effectively to someone who can use them more effectively. Transfers may be made inefficient by problems related to big bureaucracy, high costs, other barriers that make it difficult for people to transfer lands and resources from one person to another. Very typical problem, rights may not be enforced. Could be the case that the national government lacks capacity to enforce property rights in rural areas. There just aren't a lot of people out there who can help enforce those rights. And then finally, in some cases, rights might be of indeterminate or questionable duration. So in each one of these cases, if you're engaged in programming, you can ask yourself the question, is the problem here that the rights aren't clearly defined in law? If so, you might want to support some work on legal drafting to improve that situation. Or if rights aren't being enforced, you might want to support some programming that would focus on enhancing the capacity of traditional dispute resolvers. Land tenure and property rights problems can lead to a variety of serious concerns on the ground. So one of these concerns is the inequitable distribution of access to land. And a couple of high-level bullets here. In Paraguay, 80% of the land is held by less than 2% of landowners. In Guatemala, a similarly skewed distribution of land ownership, 80% of the land held by 8% of owners or producers. There is some research that suggests countries where land ownership is highly inequitable are less likely to experience robust economic growth. Even in places where, on the books, women have strong rights to land and resources, in practice, de facto, there's oftentimes a gender gap in land rights that's quite significant and that has some harmful consequences or the potential to have harmful consequences to women. And then finally, it is very typical for people in rural areas, the poorer people, more vulnerable communities, to not have as much information about the value of land and what their land rights are. This is called asymmetric information around land. Asymmetric information, unequal information around land transfers, can lead to transfers that are harmful actually to the party that lacks information. So this is another area where programming can help because you can focus on building legal awareness of rights. This slide is an example of just one of the kinds of problems that you might see in a land governance system. It's a slide of land records in Haiti, and you can see the records are contained in books. They're waiting to be digitized. The process of transferring land information from book form to digital form is a costly, time-consuming process, but once done is a process that should help improve transparency around land transfers. I talked just a moment ago about some of the concerns related to inefficiencies in land transfers, and this slide shows you how many steps you have to go through in order to formally transfer land in Haiti. From the moment you enter into a promise to sell land to somebody, you have to step through each one of these different boxes to get to the place where at the end a notary, an official, transcribes your contract and then formally registers it. Each one of these steps in the process takes time. Each one of these steps in the process probably represents a cost for the person selling and the person buying the land. Sometimes finding ways to cut down those number of steps, to make the process a bit simpler, to make it a bit more transparent, can be really helpful, sometimes almost transformative for a society, and your programming can help there.